Welcome to meeting number 11 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, September 17, 2025, the committee is resuming its review of the Conflict of Interest Act. I would like to welcome our first witness for the first hour today. As an individual, Mr. Michael Warnick is here. I always get this. This is a tough one, Mr. Warnick. The Jaroslavsky Chair in Public Sector Management at the University of Ottawa. Mr. Warnick, do you have an opening statement? The clerk just advised that you may or may not want to say something to the committee to start. If you do, I invite you to address the committee for up to 5 minutes, sir. Go ahead.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I have no long opening statement. You invited me, and I think the best thing would be to get into question and answer as possible. I just extend a word of congratulations to the new members of the committee and the new members of Parliament.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Warnick. That'll give us more time for questioning if the committee desires. Mr. Barrett, I'm going to start with you for 6 minutes, sir. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Warnick, when you were clerk of the Privy Council, you oversaw compliance of the Conflict of Interest Act. Would you say that the existing divestiture provisions, including the use of blind trusts, actually prevent conflicts of interest, or in practice, do they or can they fall short?
I think this is probably one of the central questions the committee will want to come to a view on. If you'll just permit me, I saw the conflict of interest regime as one tool in a broader toolbox about democratic governance, and there are a number of tools designed to detect and deter inappropriate points of leverage on our decision makers and keep the trust of Canadians. So very briefly, the Lobbying Act, the rules around campaign donations, the Foreign Agent Registry, security clearances, criminal code provisions. This is all helped by a beneficial ownership registry, a lobbyist registry, and transparency around government contracting and contribution agreements. Parliament created the commissioner model, and it provided for a range of remedies at the discretion of the commissioner, and one of them is a trust arrangement. So I think it's up to you to judge whether it falls short or not. I would keep it in the toolbox.
Would you say that it's effective for people who report to the Prime Minister to be the ones ensuring that the Prime Minister that they report to is not in violation of the Act?
Well, it's ultimately up to the commissioner to make rulings on that.
To make rulings on whether or not the people who report to the Prime Minister should, for example, administer a blind trust?
No, correct me if I'm wrong, but if the arrangements that any Prime Minister or Minister or office holder would make would be discussed with the Commissioner, and the Commissioner would exercise an opinion on whether they're adequate or not, can request changes and has remedies available to him or her.
Based on your experience, do you think that that works?
I think that it's going to be tricky when people come into a background, extensive background in the private sector. People come into Parliament, as you know, from many, many different backgrounds, and we want, I think one of the other purposes is to ensure broad and inclusive participation in public office. I would be very careful considering mandatory divestitures because it may end up as a deterrent to people with a private sector background coming into politics. And my view is that we need more people with private sector backgrounds in politics, not fewer.
I guess the issue is that it's a question of public confidence. Canadians being able to trust that the system that's in place is adequately ensuring that there is no conflict of interest. And in the case of an individual entering office, being elected, serving as prime minister, having significant investments, and those investments going into the blind trust, and the ethics commissioner telling us that there's not any really a lot of churn of those investments. They know what's in there. And then the conflict of interest screen is administered by direct reports to the prime minister. And the perception can be and is that there's a conflict, and that a prime minister is continuing to take decisions that further their own financial interest. And there's no reporting to the public on when a conflict of interest screen has been triggered and if it's ever been triggered. And so the higher imperative, I would say, or the leading imperative, is that we ensure that Canadians have confidence in public office holders and public institutions, and they don't seem to have that. Would you care to reflect on your time as clerk of the Privy Council? You served a prime minister who was found to have broken the act that we're studying, and twice found guilty of breaking that law. 10 different instances, and that's based on the regime as it currently exists. You must have some suggestions on improvements so that we can avoid a situation where we find a prime minister who is repeatedly breaking this law.
You have a minute, Mr. Warnick. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think we should discuss this further, because the law is built on language which includes perceived conflict of interest. And I think that's always going to be a challenge, because perceived conflict of interest can be very subjective. And somebody's going to have to exercise judgment about what is a perceived conflict and what are the appropriate remedies. Certainly you can change the act to add other provisions, more sanctions, and so on. But I think the problematic part of enforcing the act is that somebody's got to exercise judgment and discretion about perceived conflicts of interest.
In the case of Mr. Trudeau, though, it wasn't a perception; it was that he actually broke the law, and it would seem that.
Well, I mean, sorry, but you're conflating broke the law with an infraction on a perceived conflict of interest. There are many ways to break the
not
law.
A law.
Yeah, of course. But there are different remedies. Sure, but there are different remedies and sanctions available to you. Okay. And I think the committee might want to review the the array and the ladder of sanctions available.
Thank you, Mr. Warnick. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Madame Lapointe, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Ms. Lapointe, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Warnick, for being with us, and thank you for accepting our invitation. I would also like to thank you for your service as being the clerk of the Privy Council. You just stated that it's an advantage to have people coming from the private sector. I believe that's what you said to Mr. Barrett. Is that correct?
C'est ça que vous avez dit?
Mr.
Is that what you said?
Hearing us, sir? Or?
Oui,
okay.
Mais la question était dirigée à Mr. Barrett.
Non, non.
I thought the question was for Mr. Barrett. No, I was asking you about what you responded to Mr. Barrett. I believe that one of the goals is to encourage people from all different backgrounds to come to the public sector. I think that we need to be cautious and not create barriers to their arrival at the public sector rather. We never know which party leader will become prime minister. There are 15 parties in an election, and one can never know. There are prime ministers and ministers who will be working for a year or 2 years or only a few months. If we want to encourage people to come into politics, having rules that are too stark, too black and white, and forcing them to give up all of their assets. That won't be a solution. I think that we would lose people with relevant private sector backgrounds, and we'd end up with only lawyers as MPs. True, there was a time where only people who had studied in law ended up being members of parliament, both provincially and federally. And I agree with you that we need people from diverse backgrounds in order to have a better representation in the House. We heard at this committee different ideas, and I'll share some with you. If you have a blind trust, when you use it in order to avoid a perceived conflict of interest, you should sell all your assets. And I'm sure that wouldn't interest many people to come to the public service. In that suggestion, there was the mention of capital gains, because there would be capital gains on these assets. So we heard that it might not be beneficial, but I would like to hear what you have to say on that. Let's use as an example a lawyer from a large firm. It's quite easy for them to organize their affairs and leave that partnership and not be active, and come back later. For someone who has worked in the private sector, they will have investments, shares. It is possible to have a rule regarding divesting one's assets, but for someone who is risking a potentially very short career, I think that would be a significant barrier. And we would end up with people who had only worked in the public sector, lawyers, political advisors. Those will be the only ones interested in a career in partisan politics. So we should have diversity at the House of Commons. I heard that clearly. You also mentioned earlier that the Conflict of Interests Act could include different sanctions if there was to be a violation of the Act. I would like to hear more on what you have to say. We could look at a different ladder of sanctions because some infractions are worse than others. We could look to other legislation and offer a discretion to the courts to implement proportional sanctions. We could modify the threshold for fines, have some more significant fines. A violation could lead to losing one's security clearance, for example. That would be quite significant for someone working in the public sector because one cannot work without that security clearance. In the Elections Act, things are quite strict. One could be forced to not present themselves for 7 years. So, an infraction for the Conflict of Interest Act could lead to a sanction and lead to somebody not being able to present themselves as candidate for an election. But the criminal code is also there. All sanctions in the criminal code are available. The commissioner could refer the case to police services. So there are sanctions in the criminal code as well. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lapointe. Mr. Thériault, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Warnick, for being with us. You mentioned not discouraging people from the private sector to join the public sector and work in politics. A political lifestyle requires a lot of sacrifice, and it's a choice that needs to be made. The legislation that we're looking to review, well, do you believe that there should be an element against discouraging people from joining the public service? Or perhaps we can include that the highest level requires the highest level of transparency. Our role is not hiring here. Yes, of course, we want to have people from diverse backgrounds, but it's always going to be a personal decision that will require sacrifice. If people have assets and they don't want to comply to a more strict legislation, well, they won't come into politics. That's it, that's all. Do you truly see that as being a problem? Is that really what our committee should be focused on? One of the goals of the legislation and the others that I mentioned focuses on the health of our democracy. We can have a stricter regime, and it will be costly for our democratic life. So, is democratic life only linked to individuals and their competencies? Mr. Warnick, earlier I mentioned the highest level of transparency. We need to be based on principles. One of them is that ethics requires more work than law. It's not because something is legal that it is moral. Is tax avoidance something that is moral in your view? I'm not sure I understand the question. The question is simple. Is tax avoidance something that is moral? Tax avoidance? We're not talking about tax avoidance here. Yes, we are. If I'm asking the question, I'm trying to understand how exemplary you are. It's not because something is moral that it is legal. We want to review the legislation and we want to follow our principles. Do you believe that tax avoidance is something that is morally sound? In the Conflict of Interest Act, things are clear. We talk about an appearance of conflict of interest, and yes. What is a strict barrier? The Conflict of Interest Act. And so, it's not because something is legal that it is moral. And so, there was a witness who was here last week who said to us that in order to build the trust of Canadians, we needed to focus on the matter of tax avoidance. This leads to $15 to $30 billion in losses for Canada every year. And in an article from last September, we saw that the current Prime Minister was the champion in tax avoidance. Does that not mean, obviously, that he doesn't need to be excluded, but does that not mean that we need to find a way to rebuild trust? We need to ensure that our legislation can better handle such a situation. If someone who is great at tax avoidance arrives and implements these projects that will benefit him indirectly, so an appearance of conflict of interest, and in this case we're talking about Brookfield. You believe that for democracy, transparency is less important for someone joining politics? I don't see the link with the Conflict of Interest Act. There is a way to manage conflicts of interest. Perhaps we can come back to this later, but there should be a conflict of interest filter screen. The chair is letting me know that I'm out of time. You have 50 seconds, Mr. Thériault. So, you were clerk from 2016 to 2019. How many times were you asked to give your advice to the Prime Minister that he needed to recuse himself from a decision? I'm not sure. It happened every now and again before a cabinet committee meeting, but I don't remember. Did the Prime Minister have to leave the room during your mandate? And if so, how many times? I don't know. And that was 10 years ago. And yet, it's quite significant. A Prime Minister having to leave the room because he cannot make a decision on that. I think you should be able to remember that. I do not, unfortunately. Thank you, Mr. Thériault.
Round now for 5 minutes, Mr. Cooper. Go ahead, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wernick, I want to ask you a few questions about the Prime Minister's ethics screen. Would you agree that in terms of seeing that it is triggered, that requires an exercise in judgment that is subjective by those who are responsible for administering the screen?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well,
The onus is on a public office holder to provide information to the commissioner. It happens all
no,
the time.
I'm asking you, you earlier spoke about perceived conflicts of interest, and you specifically said that that requires an exercise in judgment on a subjective matter. Now, we have a Prime Minister's ethics screen that states that Mr. Carney may participate in discussions and make decisions affecting 100 free companies on matters that affect the company's interests as a member of a broad class of persons unless those interests are disproportionate to other members of a class. Now, I would note that this language of having a disproportionate interest doesn't come from the Conflict of Interest Act. It's a subjective question. It's a subjective test, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm totally comfortable that that's a job that Parliament assigns to the commissioner.
Well, the Parliament did not assign that language. That was something that was incorporated into this screen, and I would note that this language, have you seen this language in an ethics screen before? That specific language of a disproportionality test?
I think Parliament has given the commissioner the mandate to make these judgments about what is the appropriate arrangement.
I understand we have an ethics screen in place. I understand the process that led to the ethics screen. I've just asked you a very straightforward question. It should be obvious that, yes, it is a subjective test. Yes, it is a subjective standard. And the fact that you can't even answer that, I find really astounding, and it really raises the question in my mind of whether you're coming here in good faith to answer questions. Now I will ask you this, and I hope you'll agree with this, that when we're talking about the Prime Minister's ethics screen, it's extensive. It's unprecedented. 103 different companies, 103 different conflicts of interest, 103 ethics screen, right?
Sorry, what's the question?
It's pretty extensive, isn't it? Unprecedented.
Yes, it's the most extensive private sector record since Paul Martin.
Well, thank you for providing, for the first time, a straightforward answer to a straightforward question. Now, given the fact that it is an extensive ethics screen, unprecedented, as you've conceded, Canadians have serious concerns about, frankly, the lack of transparency around it, to see that it is triggered when it ought to be triggered. And you served as the clerk of the Privy Council. As clerk of Privy Council, you were pretty busy on a day-to-day basis, were you not?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so can you explain to me how it is that this is being left to the clerk of the Privy Council and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff to administer? How can Canadians have confidence that the screen is being triggered appropriately? Would you agree that there is a legitimate basis for some concern in that regard?
Well, if the committee wants to recommend disclosure of all the instances when the screen was invoked, go for it.
Well, and that's one of the problems that we have is that right now we have no idea when the screen is invoked or not. One witness came and said that really all we have is hope and trust. Do you think hope and trust is sufficient?
No, I have my faith in the commissioner.
So your answer is that you're satisfied that hope and trust is sufficient, because that's what we have with this ethics screen.
No, those are your words, Mr. Cooper. I think Parliament has given the job to the commissioner to make judgments about the appropriate screens and the appropriate sanctions.
Yeah. Well, I certainly don't have a whole lot of trust and confidence that it is being triggered appropriately. Would you support amending the Conflict of Interest Act to provide for an enforceable general anti-avoidance measure so that anyone who circumvents the act by circumventing a technical loophole would be held accountable?
I mean, that's a question for lawyers. It would have to be linked to whatever the sanctions are for an infraction, but that's used in other laws, and you would. I don't see any problem considering it for this law either.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cooper. Thank you, Mr. Wernick. Mr. Saini, you have 5 minutes, sir. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Warnick, for appearing before the committee. Mr. Poliver, as a leader of the opposition, do you think it's correct that he still does not have a security clearance? And is it ethical for a party leader to reject keep getting a security clearance?
Well, I don't want to get drawn into partisan crossfire, but I have said publicly that I do think all party leaders of parties recognized in the House of Commons should go through security clearances, largely to do with foreign interference. But in the context that we're talking about today, going through a security clearance will reveal potential points of leverage on someone. It will reveal credit issues, financial issues, personal conduct issues, business contacts, relationships, encounters with the criminal justice system, and so on. So in fact, one of the most practical ways to deal with perceived points of pressure on decision makers is to ensure they've had a security clearance.
Thank you. In your testimony, you also mentioned there are criminal situation which can be if a minister or a prime minister is in a conflict, there are criminal, because I understand that one of the senators who was charged criminally because he wasn't acting in the right interest. Can you put some light on that?
Well, there's a whole section of offenses in the criminal code. If I recall, it's section 121 about influence peddling and bribery and fraud and misconduct by public office holders and officials. There are sanctions on people trying to bribe politicians and sanctions on politicians that accept bribes, just to use one example. The criminal law is its own sort of world with very high standards on burden of proof. You're innocent until proven guilty. It has well-established rules of procedure and evidence that is a higher bar than the one Parliament has given to the various commissioners and officers of Parliament. Parliament has allowed commissioners to stray into things that are not criminal offenses, but may be important. And so that's why you have the Lobbying Act and the Ethics Act and the Conflict of Interest Act. And the standards of evidence and the standards of procedure are quite different than a criminal court.
In some parts of the world, they call themselves democracies, but to vote, you have to be a landlord or you have to have certain assets. In Canada, every Canadian, doesn't matter their background, whether they are from private background, doctors, lawyers, they are all entitled to. And I don't think it should be intent of the ethic laws to prevent people who are successful in their life as businessmen to be excluded. I would like to hear your view on those.
Well, you might want to consider looking at a preambular language to the law and making the intent clear to the courts and others that the intent of Parliament is to encourage the widest possible participation of Canadians in public life, and this applies both to partisan politics and to the public service. But that has to be balanced with the issues that raises, and therefore a Conflict of Interest Act and a Foreign Interference Act are important counterweights to that.
You have served that position as a Privy Council chair. How do you think you compare Canadian ethics law to the rest of the world that, especially the Western world, that we compare ourselves from time to time?
Well, I would commend to the committee a couple of papers that are done by the OECD, that's the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. They have 34 members. Countries, and they have a public governance secretariat. They have done comparative reports on conflict of interest legislation. I sent a link to the committee chair, the committee clerk earlier this morning. What they say is that we're not the very best, especially on some issues of enforcement, but we're respectably near in the top sort of quartile or so of the 36 member countries. There are different countries take different approaches to what's included and what's deemed and what the sanctions are. And I think Britain is a good example. Australia is a good example. The provincial regimes in Canada are a good example. There's probably a lot. I would commend to the committee to try to find somebody from the OECD Public Governance Secretariat to talk to.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sene. And the link that Mr. Wernick referenced has been received by the committee, and it will be distributed at some point today. Monsieur Thériault pour 5 minutes. S'il vous plaît.
You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Wernick, at Section 2 of the Conflict of Interest Act, we describe a person's interest by stating that it does not factor in decisions that have a general impact. Earlier, I asked you how many times you had to advise the Prime Minister to leave the room. Dom Conacher from Democracy Watch stated that that would have excluded 99% of decisions made by the higher-ups in government. So only 1% of chances where he would not have to recuse himself. Given that the world is changing and that we need to at least cover the appearance of a conflict of interest, do you not believe that the matter of personal interest should also include general impact? No, I don't agree at all, in fact. I believe that there are a lot of discussions at Cabinet on new legislation, and they have a pretty general impact. For example, new trade agreements with Mr. Trump. This is going to have an impact on all sectors, all industries, all regions of Canada. Same for the budget. I would recommend to focus on truly personal cases where there are personal ties between the decision maker and those impacted. In the examples that you gave, I could understand. But we can't automatically state that a decision that will have a general impact won't indirectly benefit one's assets. In the case that I am currently focused on, and we're not, of course, doing a review with an individual case, but this is an exceptional matter. There's someone who has become Prime Minister who was at the head of Brookfield, which controls 900 companies worth $1 trillion, and he talks about rebuilding the Canadian economy and has a bill that impacts 5 sectors mainly, and Brookfield has interests in those 5 fields. Is this not something that could lead to at least an appearance of a conflict of interest. And I'm not talking about a simple minister here. I'm talking about a prime minister. And he could try to contain this appearance, or rather, a simple minister could try to contain this appearance of a conflict of interest. But here we're talking about the prime minister who is deciding to bulldoze and bring on his bill that will have a long-term impact, perhaps long after Trump perishes. So do you not believe that these general impact decisions that could be beneficial for certain aspects of the economy will also benefit that specific company? And so it's not because you have assets in a blind trust that you're actually blind to how much is, you might not know by how much it's going to increase, but you know that there will be benefits to your trust. Now we're talking about the appearance of a conflict of interest. That's quite subjective. You need to target real conflicts of interest. I take no issue in having rules for the Prime Minister's office. You are correct that the Prime Minister does have special powers, but this is a pragmatic issue, as I mentioned. We don't know who will be the Prime Minister after the budget or next year. And so it raises another matter, which is discouraging people from becoming leaders of political parties and entering into the public service. So that's the trade-off. So are you for or against that the legislation focus also on the appearance of a conflict of interest as proposed by the Commissioner? For the Prime Minister, yes, that could be a targeted solution, but perhaps not apply it to everyone covered by the legislation, because this includes hundreds of people. And so you understand then that this is an unusual situation, never before seen. We don't want to make this personal in any way. We just want to have legislation, rules, regulations that will help us rebuild trust and to reintroduce ethics into politics. We don't want to find ourselves in situations where people raise a matter of an appearance of a conflict of interest in order to play political games. We want to have clear rules, and that need to be especially clear for the leader of the country. Mr. Hardy, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Warnick, for being with us. I'm new here in politics. I started just this year. I'm quite pleased to be at the Ethics Committee because I think that this committee will allow us to rebuild Canadians' trust in our institutions. What we're saying here is that everyone should be able to join in politics, and if our rules are too lax, we might be bringing in the wrong type of people into politics. Do you agree with that? Yes, it's up to you as legislators to find a good balance. Well, the legislation already exists, so I'm saying we don't want to attract malicious people, but we also don't want to lose out on good people. So there are these ethics screens that we mentioned, but 98% of Canadian companies are small businesses, and 99% of businesses in Quebec are small businesses. And so I would say that people like me, entrepreneurs, come into politics, and in the case that we're dealing with, and this is, of course, an exceptional case with statistics that I shared, do you not agree that we should analyze this 1% of cases to ensure that our system is able to manage such a case. Do you agree with me? No. Respectfully, pressure on decision makers can come from small business owners as well. They can look into government purchases, small details in legislation. I don't think that distinction can be made. I would like to come back to what you said earlier. I think that some careers are short. That's what you said. A politician could perhaps be around for only a few months or a few years. This seems to be a fact. People know that their time in politics could be brief. Yes, I agree. It's up to voters to decide the length of one's career. So someone who has worked in business comes into politics with the best intentions, but will always know at the back of their mind that they could potentially be quickly back at the private sector. So they'll be quickly going back to what they were doing before. I don't know the exact data, but there is a distribution. It truly depends on the rhythm of elections. There are lengthy careers, 10, 15 years in politics. But for those in political science, they've told me that there are barriers to joining the life of a politician. But you also stated that politics is temporary, so it's normal for someone to plan their career after. In this case, we have the highest official of the country named by the Prime Minister, who is the Clerk of the Privy Council, just as all nominations and Governing Council nominations. So someone who is appointed by the Prime Minister, so somebody who has his trust, will be responsible in this case for that ethics screen. We're talking about 103 potential conflicts of interest, and we're told that there's a team working on that. So the Prime Minister appoints a person that he trusts. He appoints that person. They're close, and that person manages his assets. Also, he knows that he might be back to what he was doing before in 2 or 4 years. Does that not seem clear then why the public might not trust our institutions? Should there not be a third party? So we don't want the Prime Minister to be reflecting on his next career. I believe that that should be the commissioner, the ethics commissioner. Before we get to the ethics commissioner, and perhaps you could explain the mechanism to me, but apologies, Mr. Hardy. You've gone over time. Apologies. Perhaps you can ask another question later, because we do have another round of questioning.
5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And hello, Mr. Warnick, and thank you for appearing before the committee today. And I guess my first question to you actually really goes to your experience as a very long-serving and distinguished member of the public service. The committee has been diving into this issue here for a number of weeks, and I think one of the questions that has come up fairly frequently, particularly from my friends across the way, has been around the question of impartiality or nonpartisan ethics of the public service, particularly when a conflict of interest screen is in place and managed either in whole or in part by a deputy head, a deputy minister, a clerk of the Privy Council. And so I guess my question to you would be, maybe just as a starting point, what sort of guidance, training, or ethical code or oaths are you privy to as a senior member of the public service that would guide how you would look at a situation where you were responsible for being part of managing a screen, for example?
Oh, well, I'm not going to be exhaustive, but you have all of the training that goes into all the jobs you had before you were promoted to that level and the cases that you would have dealt with. There is a guidebook which you're familiar with called Open and Accountable Government that was first made transparent by Prime Minister Harper and has been made transparent by Prime Ministers since. There is a fairly detailed infrastructure of training for senior officials and deputy ministers in specific issues. In most big departments, you have a legal services shop. You have people you can lean on for advice on specific issues. In the Privy Council office, which is the sort of secretariat for cabinet and its committees, there are people in the legal shop and in the cabinet operations shop who are very well trained and familiar with the case law and the practices and the examples that have come up. And you do end up leaning on them for advice. But I can assure Canadians that those, that's a responsibility taken very, very seriously. It is part of the role of secretary to cabinet, an office which has existed for centuries. And I'm not sure there's any other way to do it.
And maybe just practically speaking, how would a clerk or a deputy minister give effect to a conflict of interest screen? So what procedures have you either implemented or seen implemented around you to make those screens effective?
Well, overwhelmingly, the business of cabinet comes in as proposals from ministers. So you have to start at the departments, in the ministers' offices of people that are making pitches to cabinet through cabinet documents and papers. So they should be attuned to flagging and identifying any potential conflict issues if the minister has screens. And then you have on the receptor side at Privy Council office and its various teams, there might be 200 or 300 items come in a year. And if you know what the screens are, you can simply, look for them. If it's a shipbuilding case and you own Canada Steamship Lines, it's pretty obvious, those sorts of things. So I think it does get into the area of, how clear is that, as opposed to a perceived conflict that there might be some second or third order effect. But you have people that are trained and expert in this issues and accumulate experience, in exercising this function. And sometimes you would recommend, I think the minister here should go and talk to the commissioner.
And there's a notice of screen, presumably, that is circulated at times as well to inform people in and around the department about a screen?
My recollection is that people are aware of what the specific screening items are, and they are able to create a kind of a radar system for them. I don't know how it's implemented these days, but
you mentioned that there's many tools in the toolkit here. Is there any merit in your mind to bringing the conflict of interest code for members of the House of Commons to the same standards as those on a public office holder under the Act?
I think that's a judgment you'll have to make. I mean, you certainly have an influence. You're one Canadian in a million who actually gets to write laws, so you do have an enormous amount of power. I actually think it probably is the Lobbying Act that needs to be upgraded because there's a lot of lobbying of MPs and senators that's not caught.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Church. Mr. Barrett, for 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
To follow up on that line of questioning, if there's a potential conflict that's flagged, what's the evaluation process? What does that look like?
I'm not sure about the details. I mean, I think what happens is that items that come in are referred to specific secretariats. It might be economic, social, foreign policy, Indigenous affairs, or whatever. And you have an assistant secretary, sort of an ADM level person, sorry for the jargon, and they will be looking at items coming in. Most items arrive, after several rounds of interdepartmental meetings, people from the sponsoring department coming to PCO. So you don't get very many cabinet items that arrive without prior notice, and there is some time for people to take a look at the screens and see if something needs to be actioned.
And who recommends the decision that something not? Let me rephrase. Who makes the recommendation, and to whom would they make their recommendation that the screen be invoked? And so that's something that was going to go before Cabinet, not be presented with the affected public office holder being absented from the room, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not. I can't tell you for sure how it's actioned now. I left several years ago. Most cabinet business is done at committees, chaired by other ministers. So my recollection, and I stand to be corrected by people from Privy Council office, is that it would have been the assistant secretary, who's basically the secretary to each cabinet committee, and in the case of full cabinet, it is the clerk.
And so, at the end of my last round, we talked about the effectiveness of having the chief of staff or having the clerk of the Privy Council, who both serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister, responsible for ensuring that that the Act isn't violated. They're the ones that are advising or protecting against this from happening. In the case of Mr. Trudeau, it didn't work. And in the case of Mr. Carney, he's got 103 potential conflicts that are flagged, and we're left with the same system, and it's left in the hands of these individuals. Now, look, they both can be long-serving and well-regarded. But the problem is who their boss is and what their function is to prevent the conflict. And in this case, the risk of a decision being made by the Prime Minister that could further his own financial interests, this goes to the heart of the erosion of confidence that Canadians have in their public institutions. Do you recognize that there is a weakness in this system?
I mean, I think you could tell the story of the last Parliament that all of those issues were detected and made public and became a subject of parliamentary discussion or investigations by the Commissioner. So at some level, the system is drawing out those issues. I don't think you can describe potential issues of perceived conflict in the future in a way that can really be legislated for with a lot of clarity. But there's just too much subjectivity.
You mentioned that there's a process in place that prevent the items from ending up on the agenda or flagging them for cabinet committees. So the record keeping and the note taking exists. Should the law require public reporting of when the screen is invoked, it wouldn't require a great lift of those involved to report it if that were what the law required.
Yeah, first of all, I mean, the remedy is rarely take the item off the agenda, it's recusal. So if there's a minister in the room that may have a perceived conflict, they'll step out for that item. And
is there a practicality? Pardon the interruption, I just a very short time.
Yep.
Is there a practicality issue when the minister in question is the first minister, and these are like massive concerns or massive issues that are being considered?
Yeah, as I said to a previous question, I have no objection or problem with you writing specific rules for the Prime Minister's office, given that the Prime Minister plays a particular role, in cabinet. And I have no problem with your suggestion, but what I would suggest is that those invocations of the screen be disclosed to the Commissioner. And the Commissioner can come to a view what they want to do about it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wernick. Monsieur Sarré, pour 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Sarré, you have 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. I would also like to thank Mr. Wernick for being with us today. I would like to start by saying that your experience as clerk of the Privy Council and working for the government puts you among the most credible people to speak on ethics. And I am quite eager to read the OECD report that you shared. You mentioned that we are doing quite well, but that we are not the best yet. and we want to be among the best. Mr. Wernick, you know that the public's trust towards its institutions relies on perception, the perception of integrity, of transparency in how the state's affairs are managed. You manage teams at higher levels of the public service. My first question would be, would you agree that we should harmonize the code on conflicts of interest for MPs with the Public Office Holders Code as included in the Conflicts of Interest Act? I don't know. We just discussed the difference between decision makers, prime ministers, ministers. There needs to be a proportionality. So yes, harmonization, but there needs to be a distinction between the different levels of decision makers. So perhaps asking legal counsel, lawyers on the specific wording. Next question. What things would be essential to make the screen more efficient for managing conflicts of interest? To start, we need to strengthen the role of the commissioner and his powers, but it needs to be proportional, of course. If we want to have a very strict regime with criminal sanctions, perhaps set aside the matter of an appearance or an apparent conflict of interest and target conflicts of interest that are more objective, less subjective. Regarding Canadians' trust, I would recommend that you recommend to your colleagues in caucus and other committees to strengthen other rules for decision makers. The foreign agent registry, for example, needs to be implemented. The access to information legislation should also cover political advisors. The lobbyists registry should include all contacts with MPs and senators. Unfortunately, the previous Parliament did not adopt the Modernized Elections Act. You can speak to your leaders as MPs in order to come back to that and implement them and strengthen the role of the commissioners. This legislation is very important and can be improved, but it's part of many tools that we have at our disposal to defend our democracy. I always come back to the same question. Our goal, our ultimate goal, is to have the public's trust. As you know, trust can be stronger or weaker depending on people's perception. So, an apparent conflict of interest could undermine the public's trust just as much as a real conflict of interest. And so, institutions, government, the House of Commons, decision makers, how should they all better manage that matter of perception? A brief response, please, Mr. Wernick. We're out of time.
To establish confidence, it's not the absence of cases coming up that would make them confident. They would always be wondering what else is happening. I think you do, because deciders and the people putting pressure on them are human beings, there are going to be cases. There are going to be cases of conflict of interest and perceived conflict of interest. And the fact that cases are detected and sanctioned is what Canadians should be looking for.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wernick. Merci, Monsieur Sarre. That concludes our first hour for today, Mr. Wernick. I want to thank you on behalf of the committee for appearing today. We're going to suspend briefly. Mr. Cooper, I understand, is already online, so this shouldn't take too long. The meeting is suspended. For our second hour, I want to welcome our next witness, Mr. Sam Cooper, who is a journalist with the Bureau News. Mr. Cooper, welcome to committee. I just want to make sure, I know you've had your sound tested, want to make sure that the French interpretation, you're prepared for that, because there will be some questions that will be asked of you in French. And I was at your justice appearance meeting recently. I was in the back row, and I know that you speak very quickly, so I'm just going to remind you, because of interpretation, we want to make sure that you speak as clearly and just to make sure that the interpretation works. I understand also, Mr. Cooper, that you don't have an opening statement, that you would just like to go to questions, and so we're going to start that if you're okay. If you do want to say something to committee, I invite you to do that now. But if not, then I'm going to go to Mr. Barrett for 6 minutes.
That works for me. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Barrett, go ahead, please.
Your reporting notes that Brookfield maintained over $3 billion in politically sensitive investments connected to China and its state-linked real estate and energy companies. Can you explain how Prime Minister Carney's role in Brookfield's ties to the regime in China?
Sure, I'll go off memory of my own reporting. Thinking of that story, which I wrote in the lead up to the federal election, I researched into Brookfield's investments in China, and on the real estate file, I noted that after 2015, Brookfield had made very substantial China-based real estate investments, and due to my knowledge of Beijing's United Front networks, I noted that one of the key Hong Kong investors connected to the projects in which Brookfield was investing was part of China's political consultative conference. That was important to me because the Central Intelligence Agency notes that people on that high-level Chinese communist entity are involved, the CIA says, in Beijing's sort of global United Front networks. That's how the Chinese Communist Party brings influential people together. So I noted in my reporting that for Brookfield to get access to that same type of investment project on a major real estate deal in China, together with a very elite Hong Kong real estate tycoon, certainly in my learned opinion, it would take a special kind of access to get that kind of deal. So then tracking forward through when Prime Minister Carney joins Brookfield, in the surrounding years, I noted that the real estate market in China had plummeted. At some point, Brookfield needed to secure some, let's call it sort of a re-injection of capital, and it turned out that it emerged that the Bank of China, as others have reported, was involved in bridging some capital to reinfuse that deal in China's troubled real estate market. So stepping back from that, I noted that people in Mr. Carney's position in Brookfield's, Mr. Carney also traveling to China to meet with senior Communist Party officials around the timing of the Bank of China, assisting Brookfield with their real estate investment. That would certainly, in my mind, raise, the questions around access and influence.
Mr. Carney was the chair at Brookfield during that time. Then he enters public office. You talk about his ties, relationships with the regime in China. Is there any evidence to suggest that those ties have been maintained since he's entered elected office?
Well, in my research focusing on Brookfield, which is the nature already in previous testimony, I heard Brookfield and Mr. Carney's 103 potential investment vulnerabilities come up. Look, my work is based on open source investigations, and Mr. Carney, I noted in the timeline back to his days with the Bank of England, had worked on establishing a special relationship between the Bank of England and the Bank of China, and which is, of course, controlled by the Chinese Communist Party in terms of global monetary systems. So I felt that was important as a researcher. Through the years, Mr. Carney, when he joins Brookfield, prior to entering politics, repeatedly travels to Beijing and meets with senior officials, including President Xi Jinping. And I noted that for business persons at that time of Mr. Carney's stature to appear with Xi Jinping, again, as China's economy is in need of foreign investment. And while investments into China are becoming more dangerous in the view of some Western capitalists, having Mr. Carney be in those meetings, I do think is important. And you could say fairly is beneficial to Xi Jinping, as it would be beneficial to Mark Carney, the business person, in his time at Brookfield. So when we enter Mr. Carney's race to become the liberal nominee for prime minister, I did note that as the Globe and Mail broke the story that Mr. Carney met with an entity called the Jiangsu Chamber of Commerce in Toronto, I was very aware already that that Commerce Department had overt ties to the United Front Work Department. And indeed, politically connected Canadians are honorary chairs with that entity. So I do think there's much reporting that hasn't come out on exactly what the Jiangsu Chamber of Commerce is and what Mr. Carney's meeting, which he denied at first, as you know, he denied elements of the Globe and Mail's reporting. So there's controversy around what really happened in that meeting.
Unfortunately, I'm out of time. I appreciate your answers.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bear. Monsieur Sarré, pour 6 minutes, commencez, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Sarré, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to start by thanking Mr. Cooper for being with us online today and for his work. And he has been an investigative journalist for years, and thank you very much, Mr. Cooper, for your work. In all democracies, journalists play an essential role. They ask questions, sometimes difficult questions, and they contribute to the transparency of our institutions. These contributions need to be recognized. Our committee is meeting today, and we have responsibilities that are similar to the media. We look into issues with a legislative view. We focus on verified facts, and we look at the rules, and we look after the well-being, the institutional well-being of our country. So our role is a little different from journalists, but is also very important. We want to put things into perspective and ensure balance between vigilance and trust in our institutions. It is important today to distinguish between cases that are more general, that can be found in public spaces, and journalists raise hypotheses and seek to stimulate discussion, and we want to understand how the ethical mechanism for transparency truly works and how we can strengthen it. Mr. Cooper, you know that Canada has an ethics commissioner, a lobbying commissioner, and accountability measures that are constantly evolving. Another witness stated that we're among the best for ethics, but not the best. But we are committed to integrity and the public trust. I believe that our committee can play a constructive role. We're not trying to, or rather, we are trying to ensure that the rules remain clear, that they are adapted to modern times, and that they are understood by all. Mr. Cooper, what you have to say is useful, and it reminds us the importance of transparency. The best service that we can give to Canadians is to listen to you. We need to listen to all different voices and examine the truth and strengthen the public's trust. That is our goal, and I wanted to repeat it. Now, all that said, it is important to state that the work of a journalist does not always have the same standards for verification as our parliamentary work. there are anonymous tips, for example, and could give the impression of truth without being fully verified. Many have noted for your work, Mr. Cooper, and I'm not a specialist there, that some of your conclusions are based on hypotheses that can have various interpretations. We would prefer things to be irrefutable truths. This does not undermine your commitment, but highlights that parliamentarians need to have an analysis set in context. Research needs to be done, and sometimes impact matters more than rigorously verifying facts. I also believe that we can't have simplified conclusions. Our responsibility is not to react to the story of the day, but to have strong policies based on facts. I would like to now ask you a question, Mr. Cooper. You have written a lot on interference and transparency. And so, my question is as follows. How can, in the public space, we better seek a better balance between investigative journalism and, at the same time, not undermining the Canadians' trust in our institutions?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chair. The question brings to my mind the central issue for this hearing is whether impartiality of the Ethics Commissioner and the Privy Council Office Clerk are sufficient to provide Canadians with the confidence that the ethics screens in place for our prime ministers, cabinet ministers, will work very simply. And so in my own research, some of you will know, I started as a reporter in British Columbia. My work led to the Cullen Commission into anti-money laundering. And Justice Cullen, who credited my investigations and savvy reporting and questioning with leading to that commission, one of his top 3 recommendations was that the British Columbia government had effectively demonstrated that they needed an independent anti-money laundering commissioner who did not report to the premier or serve at the pleasure of the premier's cabinet, because there was simply a loss of trust that BC would be able to police its own money laundering institutions.
Mais avant d'aller
And
plus
I
loin,
say, I say the same issue here. It relates to Ethics Commission in Ottawa. I think there's enough reporting that Canadians have very valid questions.
Je m'excuse,
juste-
Monsieur Sarré, mais
parce que je voulais juste
c'est
être-
7 minutes. que tu-
Apologies, Mr. Sari. 7 minutes. Could you... Mr. Thériault, you have 6 minutes. Apologies, Mr. Sari, your time is over. You can come back to your question later. Mr. Thériault, you have 6 or perhaps 7 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Mr. Cooper. I'm not sure if you were tuned in to the previous session, if you were online. Were you listening to Mr. Wernick? Yes. The former clerk of the Privy Council was stating that he was reticent regarding an appearance of a conflict of interest. He was saying that it was subjective. When the Ethics Commissioner decides to carry out an investigation, it's because there is an appearance of a conflict of interest, and he needs to establish whether or not there is a conflict of interest. And so this is an important notion. He has suggested indicating proactively to elected officials in reading the legislation to prepare against a conflict of interest. You also need to be prepared against an apparent appearance of a conflict of interest. When Mr. Wernick stepped down in 2019, he stated, "It is essential that Canadians continue to believe in the nonpartisanship of their public service and that they can be reassured that they are offered an excellent service and that they can trust the government that they elected." I agree with that statement, that appearances are important. They are important in maintaining the public's trust. Where our opinions are different is that appearances are also important when we're talking about a conflict of interest in order to maintain the public's trust. What do you think of broadening the legislation to include an apparent conflict of interests?
Thank you for the question. I believe very simply that Canada's democracy demands that the legislation is broadened. Point one, there should be an independent arm to administering ethics screens. And two, it should be broadened for the perception of conflict, because as the prior members' questioning pointed towards, the public, just as journalists, can make observations that successful business persons may have had a long history of engagement with foreign governments or foreign businesses. And when said business persons take a seat of power in Ottawa, Canadians reasonably believe that they are human like anyone else, and relationships can extend from business into politics, and in fact do. So I think it's important that that perception of conflict that reasonable people, well-read people can perceive does extend to the ethics regime.
Il y a la perception.
So we're talking about the appearance of a conflict of interest and the perception. I might perceive a conflict of interest, but it's not just anyone who is going to decide whether or not that perception is legitimate. It's the ethics commissioner who will state that there is a case of an appearance of a conflict of interest, and there is a difference there. We can't only work uphill on the perception, and I imagine that you agree with these comments.
I agree.
OK. Maintenant.
Thank you. Now, we have also heard talk about the current commissioner, and when the Prime Minister declared his interests, was told to put everything into a blind trust. Many witnesses questioned how blind a blind trust truly is. Also, there was an agreement because these ethics screen are not in the legislation. It was a suggestion, and that filter was going to be managed by the clerk of the Privy Council. So what do you think about that and the public's trust? And furthermore, should it not be managed by an independent commissioner and not employees of the Prime Minister?
I agree absolutely that it should be an independent commissioner of ethics that does not serve at the pleasure or is not appointed by the Prime Minister. And furthermore, the ethics screen, I would go further. Canadians, I would like to say at this point, have lost some confidence in integrity and transparency in Ottawa. The simple solution here is full divestiture of prior investments. Some will say that's not practical, but in my opinion, what is not practical is that a Privy Council office clerk with their many different functions would be the one responsible for day-to-day knowledge of if there's a clear conflict, a second or third order conflict. The world is becoming more complex, not less. The world is becoming more hostile in terms of outside powers that are not friendly to Canada seeking influence in Ottawa. So I would agree with the member that it needs to be independent and more legal regulations need to be put in less. The current system is not enough.
Oui. Lorsque j'ai posé la question,
When I asked this question to the current commissioner, he stated that he would judge a case of a conflict of interest. If we were to have an independent commissioner, we could have someone to ensure a follow-up with the Prime Minister and his office, and that person would be accountable, and that commissioner could be impartial if there was to be an issue.
Cooper, please.
If that was a question, I believe that's a perfect system. Use what's in place and then have that extra independent judge with a special distance.
Thank you. From one Mr. Cooper to another. Mr. Cooper, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Cooper, I want to ask you some questions about Brookfield, given your investigative journalism on Brookfield. Brookfield has significant investments in Beijing state-linked enterprises, more than $3 billion of investments, correct?
Correct.
And during his tenure as chair of Brookfield, Mark Carney played a significant role in expanding Brookfield's footprint in the PRC, correct?
Recalling my research, his work into, I believe it was green power businesses with connections to China was an expansion, yes.
Was involved in the refinancing in 2019 in relation to Shanghai commercial real estate worth billions.
That investment continued into his time taking over an executive role with Brookfield, yes.
And would it be fair to characterize Brookfield's investments in the PRC as politically sensitive?
In my view, as an expert on China's United Front system, as I said before, the nature of that real estate investment and the other parties involved, I do believe it would very much touch on the Chinese Communist Party's control.
And so would it be accurate to say that the Beijing-based communist regime has a significant amount of leverage over Brookfield with respect to its investments, and that if Brookfield wants to make a return on its investments, it would be very much in Brookfield's interest to maintain a good relationship with the Beijing-based communist regime? I think that would be fair, wouldn't it?
At a basic level, I do think it's fair that international business persons, even of the type of Michael Bloomberg, have been recognized to take into consideration the Communist Party's wishes, yes.
We have a prime minister who has significant financial interests tied to Brookfield, worth millions, and we have Brookfield, in turn, being deeply intertwined with a communist regime based in Beijing. On a broad level, shouldn't that concern Canadians? Vis-a-vis the Prime Minister, in fulfilling his duty to put Canada's interests first when his private financial interests in Brookfield are deep, which in turn is deeply intertwined with the PRC.
In fairness, I think business analysts would say it's almost impossible for international business persons to not be doing business with Chinese state entities in some ways. But I do think it's fair to say if a company has a very strong balance towards businesses in China, such as the real estate investment or the green investments I've talked about, Canadians should be aware of that, definitely.
And Mark Carney, as recently as October of 2024, while he was advising the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, as his economic advisor, went over to Beijing, met with, in secret meetings, among others, the deputy governor of Beijing's central bank, and 2 weeks later secures a $250 million loan from Brookfield. Not anyone can just do that, can they? Unless they have significant ties with the regime at the highest levels.
There's no question. I noted the timeline of that visit to China and the deal securing funding from the Bank of China. It's not to say that there's a definite tie there, but the timing is interesting and I think relevant.
And I just want to ask you about Brookfield's real estate investments. You referenced an individual who is connected to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which the CIA has identified as a United Front entity. That individual is Vincent Lo, correct?
That's correct.
And Vincent Lo served as Brookfield's primary real estate partner, or one of their primary partners in the region, right?
To my recollection, he was a key partner on that development.
And Lo would have played that role during the time that Carney was chair of Brookfield, involved in real estate in the PRC, right?
If the structure of the deal continues, which I believe so, that would be the case.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Ms. Church, for 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper, I wanted to ask you a question that I asked the earlier witness today, and that is that, as you are probably no doubt aware, there is a code for members of Parliament, an ethics code, in addition to the Conflict of Interest Act that applies to public office holders. And I was just wondering whether or not you thought that both members and public office holders should be brought within the same standards, whether there was a usefulness to that.
I think there's a usefulness, and I was impressed with Mr. Wernick's answer of the training and professionalism and the legal consultations that do occur with impartiality. So the structure is there, and it should be applied as broadly as possible.
Because I imagine that you would see that we've been talking a fair amount of Brookfield as an example today, and that there's members from across the political spectrum who've invested in Brookfield as an entity. Perhaps one of the reasons why the code should be expanded to include the same coverage as the Act itself.
As far as I understand the framework you're laying out, yes, it should be applied broadly to parliamentarians and staff.
And Mr. Wernick, in his appearance today, also talked a little bit about how the conflict of interest regime, and along with other regimes like the security regime, for example, can actually uncover areas of leverage where foreign agents or foreign governments might have on a public office holder. Would you agree with his assessment?
I do agree with him that the structure is there and the professional training in staff is there. Where I would step back a little bit is I also agree with Duff Conacher's testimony in the view that I'm not sure the application of those rules has been up to the standard that some Canadians would want to see.
We've been talking a little bit about the perceptions of conflict of interest. What guardrails would you suggest to ensure let's call it the veracity of an apparent conflict of interest? The sort of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. This is one of the problems we have as legislators, is how do we define this? How would you suggest that we put some guardrails around what constitutes an apparent conflict of interest?
That's a question that may go beyond my knowledge, but I do agree with the prior member's position that the structure in place where the commissioner would recognize a potential conflict, and let's just say if there's a lot of meat to the bone, they could pass it on to a next level independent commissioner. That seems to make sense to me.
Have a view as to at what point a relationship with a private entity would become subject to conflict of interest concerns? Like, for example, if a public office holder no longer worked for a private entity, would that generate a conflict of interest concern in your mind?
I've heard prior studies and testimony where a length of years, from the exit from a relationship to being able to re-engage so that it wouldn't trigger a perceived conflict is useful. But I'd like to say that I could be out of my depth in terms of the minutia of the regulations you're trying to get to the bottom of right now.
You're saying that any relationship that a person would have brought to public office that may include having worked for an employer in the past could engage the Conflict of Interest Act in your mind?
It certainly could, and the closer that relationship is to one being in office and that prior relationship, the window of time, I would think naturally sort of increases the potential perception of conflict.
What if somebody had no role in either working with or managing an entity and no financial interest? Would that engage a Conflict of Interest Act?
I'm not sure. I don't think I can meaningfully answer that example.
So in reality, you're not really sure as to what the boundaries of the Conflict of Interest Act are today or what they should be. You have no views on those matters.
I don't have views on the minutiae. My strong views are on the need for an independent layer at the end of the day.
And the Ethics Commissioner's Office is not independent enough for you?
In my understanding, I lean towards Duff Conacher's testimony that it's not independent enough, no.
And why is
Thank
that?
you, Mrs. Church.
Thank you,
so
Mr.
much.
Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Monsieur Thériault pour 5, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Thériault, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Earlier, you talked about the ties between Brookfield, China, Mr. Carney. I was thinking about everything that was done to try to counter Chinese foreign interference in Canada and in our political lives during the previous Parliament. I was also reflecting on the bill that we just tabled so that we don't end up with child slaves and that we are not purchasing products steeped in blood. Is this not a potential conflict of interest with a general scope? You have carried out studies and research. Do you believe that the government, starting with its Prime Minister, would vote for such a large impact bill? Or should they avoid it, given the interests that need to be protected for Brookfield and interests that are shared with China, that they should vote against such a bill? That is a conflict of interest that might not have a direct impact on my blind trusts, but it would have a more general impact and has a real conflict of interest. I would like you to share your point of view, because some might say that conflicts of interest with a general impact aren't significant, but when you have the power to make decisions that would benefit your own investments, well, that's what we're talking about today. I would like to hear what you have to say.
Thank you for the question. I think that is a question that gets to the heart of the decisions before you with the Conflict Act and the current ethics regime, and even the global trade issues which Ottawa is confronted with. I'd say that if we look at what, I think it's helpful to raise the example of what is happening in the government of Keir Starmer right now. There's a controversy reported on every day by British media with regards to an alleged case of Chinese interference of insiders getting information on critics of China and allegedly providing it through the Ministry of State Security to high levels of the Chinese Communist Party, I noted that powerful American lawmakers were so disconcerted with reports coming out of Britain that they sent a letter to the British ambassador, warning that it appeared that Britain's government had stepped away or potentially politically intervened in a prosecution around the timing of China seeking to construct what's called a mega embassy in Britain, which raises certain concerns. So to your question, honorable member, yes, if you're looking at global trade and the potential of slave-produced goods from Xinjiang coming into Canada, this is a very pertinent issue. I reported on a letter sent from then Senator Marco Rubio and others to the former Minister of Trade, Mary Ng, in which the U.S. lawmakers expressed concern that it seemed that goods were being transshipped through Canada into the United States in a using subterfuge. And so the question again is, was Canada holding up, its end of its deal with the United States and Mexico on trade to bar against slave-produced goods? So indeed, I think the question you raise is there a conflict with regards to how a whole government might take action on a bill, whether we're talking about a bill such as the one raised by MP Michael Chon, or whether the British Parliament, whether some people, due to wanting to keep trade between Britain and Beijing running at full steam, might have intervened in a prosecution about espionage inside Westminster. That's a very important question, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Merci, Monsieur Thériault. Monsieur Hardy, excusez pour 5.
Thank you, Mr. Thériault. Mr. Hardy, you have 5 minutes. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Cooper. I just want to be sure that I understand when we're talking about perception versus public opinion. When you carry out your research as a journalist, what is your process to ensure that you are sharing facts and not opinions? Because I think that that's an important issue. People need to know that journalists are not only sharing their perception. So what is your process?
Thank you for the question. It depends on the journalist. It depends on the training. I can speak to my own experience. I've been trained at the University of Toronto with an undergraduate degree in history, philosophy, and English. So I took that level of learning and I applied it to a journalism program at a school in British Columbia, where you learn the same skills that an honorable member or a lawyer or a regulator might apply to hearing different perspectives, hearing facts or potential facts from different sources, and bringing them into one's capacity to sift those facts. So in gathering the facts and then reporting them, look, there is opinion in reporting, there is assessment, there is getting at the best level of journalism, getting all sides, and then using an expert level understanding of the issue as best as the journalist can, and putting forward a story in good faith to try to help the widest range of citizens understand the issue.
Merci, parce que c'est exactement ce que vous faites. Vous ramenez des faits, vous faites
Thank you, because that's what you're doing. You're sharing facts, you carry out in-depth research, and that's beyond political influence. Of course, there's always some opinion in there, but it is important to share facts so that we can judge them here. You stated that you have listened to our previous meetings, and we have the 3 commissioners, lobbying, ethics, and they all stated that they are underfunded. Same for access to information. Access to information requests were often ignored. Do you believe that it's an issue, especially federally, to have institutions that have mechanisms in place, but they do not have sufficient power to properly maintain the public's trust towards its institutions?
I do believe, if I can speak a little bit broadly, that Canada at a provincial level, as I've said in British Columbia, what I've observed in Ottawa, I believe the same issues present themselves, that Canada is underfunded when it comes to regulatory oversight, especially when it becomes politically sensitive. Again, let me compare British Columbia. Commissioner Austin Cullen of the Cullen Anti-Money Laundering Commission recommended that British Columbia institute an independent officer of the legislature to crack down on money laundering. I would note that that recommendation hasn't been followed in British Columbia. So not only is there no funding behind that most important recommendation on a very important issue for Canada in BC, but there's no position in place. I think the same can be said from what I observe in Ottawa. Funding for a commissioner is needed. There's more funding needed, and it needs to be independent. I'd go further. I believe an independent anti-corruption agency is needed that could, apply investigations where the RCMP may not have the capacity to look at politically sensitive cases.
OK. Merci beaucoup. Écoutez.
Thank you. You are correct. In a crisis, the first reaction is to overcorrect. Do you believe that our democracy is in crisis and that Canadians would need to see their institutions change their actions significantly so that the institutions can rebuild trust and put democracy at the heart of the equation?
Seconds, Mr. Cooper, to answer that one. Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. This is my opinion. I've been looking into Ottawa very deeply for about 7 years of reporting. This has regarded money laundering concerns, corruption concerns, political interference concerns. It is my own opinion that Canada, like the British government at this moment, is at a point of crisis where there are questions, good questions for the public, that might doubt that their governments are adequately responding to foreign interference and potential integrity and corruption issues.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cooper. Merci, Mr. Hardy. Madame Lapointe, 5 minutes, mais je pense
Ms. Lapointe, you have 5 minutes, but I think I understood that you will be sharing your time with Mr. Saini. I'll let you know when you have 2.5 minutes left. The floor is yours. Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Cooper. It's interesting to be able to chat with you. We're talking about reviewing the Conflict of Interest Act, and colleagues have mentioned that we've heard from other commissioners, the lobbying commissioner, the ethics commissioner. We have also heard from different lawyers who have testified here. Civil society representatives have come to speak with us as well. Before you today, we heard from the former clerk of the Privy Council, Mr. Warnick, who came to share his point of view with us. Currently, we are studying the Conflict of Interest Act. There will be future studies, of course, that we will have to carry out. That said, we want to look at the tools that we have at our disposal and how we can improve them. You have a background in journalism, and you often made reference to China and Great Britain. You also talked about BC. A few witnesses made reference to BC. You also talked about independence. I'm surprised that you believe that the Conflict of Interest Commissioner is not independent enough. I'm a little bit surprised, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. How can we make the process more independent. As a journalist, you have some experience. You've looked at the Conflict of Interest Act in Canada, the one that we are currently studying, and I would like to know how you are able to make comments on Canada's Conflict of Interest Act.
Thank you for the question. My insight into the ethics question comes mainly in relation to one of your prior witnesses, Duff Conacher of Democracy Watch. I've interviewed Mr. Conacher a number of times and reported on some of his recommendations and opinions. So very clearly, and I'll be upfront, most of my technical knowledge does come from another witness, Mr. Conacher. However, where I add my own assessment and opinion to your question of why I believe that the current system isn't independent enough, I do agree with the members that have said, and Mr. Wernick, that there is a professional civil service and there are legal consultations. There is a framework in place, but my reporting, in my own opinion, has shown in practice, bureaucrats are human. Ottawa is not the biggest place in the world, and it can be that that humans might not take the decision to take a regulatory action against an elected member who may have appointed them or whose predecessor may have appointed them. I think that that's a question in front of the members.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, je veux juste aller un petit peu plus loin. Je veux juste comprendre.
Thank you. I just want to understand from your answer, you're mostly inspired by what we heard from Mr. Duff Conacher. Were you able to listen to other witnesses, the ethics commissioner, the lobbying commissioner, the other academics? You, if I understood correctly, interviewed one person, and from that person, you are making recommendations regarding reviewing our legislation, and you believe that our conflict of interest commissioner is not sufficiently independent to judge the integrity of people. And so I would like for you to respond that you are inspired by only one single person.
Thank you for the question. That's not quite correct. I'm in terms of the technicalities with regards to the Act and recommendations for improvements, most of my knowledge would come from Mr. Conacher. I have followed the reporting on the hearings. I haven't watched every day.
Okay, merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Madame Lapointe. Il reste juste 10 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Lapointe. We have 10 minutes. Mr. Barrett, you have 5 minutes, followed by Mr. Saini for 5 minutes.
Is the lack of transparency in the investments that Prime Minister Carney has, does that present a risk to the confidence that Canadians can have in our democratic institutions? Specifically, you look at things like the global transition funds that he set up when he was at Brookfield. Do we know what is bundled up in those investments? Of the investments that are included, who is benefiting from those investments that Brookfield made? Which foreign state or adversarial state owned enterprises or controlled enterprises, for example, and investments that are domiciled in offshore tax havens. Is that lack of transparency, does it present a challenge in your view when Parliament, when the media, when members of the public are trying to have clarity and certainty around the interests that a public office holder has? We hear that, just leave this all in the hands of the ethics commissioner, but there's some opaqueness that the ethics commissioner isn't able to cut through as well, and certainly doesn't have a mandate to dig into in the level of detail that you have, the relationships that led to some of those investment decisions.
Thank you for the question. In my reporting, the nature of the many different investments that Brookfield has with Chinese state entities, there are some investments connecting to Middle Eastern entities. As you said, I reported on the nature of investment funds or vehicles run through lower transparency jurisdictions in the Caribbean. I think all of those do present fair questions for Canadians that follow these matters closely. And I agree with others in this hearing that have said, or the prior hearing with Mr. Wernick, that hope and trust on the part of Canadians, I don't think is a good policy, especially in light of the rising geopolitical risks that we recognize Canada is facing.
It's been proposed by some and discussed here at this committee that the term in the Act that requires that the public office holder divest of their controlled assets, that the definition that allows them to simply move them into a blind trust doesn't achieve what we now see with the fullness of time, what we need to have happen in order to maintain Canadians' confidence. Do you think that divesting by having the public office holder sell their assets and then have the funds managed and reinvested in trust would improve the confidence that Canadians have and add a level of add another safeguard so that Canadians know that the decisions that public office holders are taking, the cabinet, the prime minister are taking, are in the national interest and not in their personal interest or their own financial interest?
I absolutely think that that's a step that would give the average Canadian a greater level of confidence. It's my own personal opinion that very international business persons of the level of Prime Minister Carney or former Prime Minister Paul Martin, it's just the nature of global investment that you will be engaging with often foreign states or very wealthy people from foreign states. So I do believe what the member suggested is a good step.
Go ahead, Mr. Cooper. You got 30 seconds.
Just to jump in, you referenced earlier that the Prime Minister had met with individuals affiliated with the United Front at the Jiangsu Chamber of Commerce in Markham. That wasn't the only time that Mark Carney met with United Front leaders during the Liberal leadership, was it? He also met with United Front leaders in Steveston, Richmond East, which was the epicenter of the disinformation campaign by Beijing against Kenny Chu, correct?
Quick response, Mr. Cooper.
I recognized from open reporting from my colleague Bob Mackin in Vancouver that video evidence did show that United Front associated members were at that meeting with Mr. Carney.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Sene, for 5 minutes, please go ahead.
Thank you. As a journalist, you often
En tant que journaliste,
unnamed intelligence or law enforcement sources. Without transparency about who these individuals are or their motivation, how can Canadians place confidence in your conclusions or in your ability to separate facts from politics?
Thank you for your question. It's a great question. Canadians would have to look at my track record, which is excellent, which is not perfect. No one is perfect. For Mr. Chair, I can add a little bit more about my why Canadians should trust me. As I said, attended University of Toronto, as both my parents did, attended journalism school, had considered going into law, chose journalism because I believed in the power of truth. And all I can put forward is a little bit about my background and my record as it exists.
Mr. Cooper, I understand you are involved in some lawsuits currently, and there's a record that you have spoken and told lies to other committees. How can, after knowing all that record, is there a belief that your information is credible?
Thank you for your question. I strongly disagree with your statement, and maybe you can expand on that if you would like.
Involved in any, or have you settled any lawsuits or involved in lawsuits currently based on your reportings?
There are lawsuits in relation to reporting on election interference. I can't comment on legal matters in this forum.
Have you settled out of court on some of those issues in the past?
Records exist, and the member can search them if he wants. I'm not at liberty to discuss legal issues in this hearing.
Mr. Cooper, I'm asking you personally, have you settled out of court settlement because of the stuff that you have printed?
Mr. Chairman, I've presented my answer on these matters.
I'm going to share my time with Mr. Sari.
Go ahead, sir. You have 2 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. As I stated earlier, I would like to congratulate the work of investigative journalism. And I would like to thank Mr. Cooper for his work over the past few years. But the words that we use are important. You talked about having someone who was more independent than the ethics commissioner and the clerk. But did I understand correctly that for you, we're talking about impartiality?
Alors, est-ce que vous sous-entendez que, par exemple, le
Are you
commissaire...
stating that the Commissioner of Ethics and the Clerk of the Privy Council are not impartial?
Thank you for your question. My statement was that in agreement with the witness, Mr. Conacher of Democracy Watch, the system of impartiality, while professional and informed by an existing framework, I don't believe, in my own opinion, is strong enough. And I said it resembles what Commissioner Austin Cullen in the British Columbia hearings into integrity and anti-money laundering said. The record in British Columbia showed that government wasn't distant enough from decisions around financial integrity, and an independent officer of the legislature was needed.
Mais ma question est directe. Est-ce que pour vous, les deux
But my
personnes...
question is, very brief, please. Are the Commissioner and the Clerk impartial in your view?
Thank you for the question. My answer is they are humans in an imperfect system, and I think the pattern of the Commission in British Columbia applies to the same principles in Ottawa with regards to the ethical framework and the need for fully independent officers that are not serving at the pleasure of a political body or minister.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cooper. Monsieur Sarret. Mr. Cooper, I want to thank you for your appearance before the committee today. I appreciate your responses to the questions. I have no other business for the committee, so the meeting is adjourned.